Rain lashed the island of Valera like a punishment from the heavens. Waves rose and crashed against the cliffs, their roar mixing with the low growl of thunder. Inside the glass-walled mansion that stood like a fortress above the sea, Alexander Vane sat before the dying fireplace, the orange light flickering across his unshaven face. He had not spoken to another soul in weeks. The storm outside matched the one inside him. 3 years had passed since the plane went down over the Tyrrhenian Sea, taking his wife with it. Every gust of wind reminded him of the final message she sent before the silence. He came to this island to disappear, to forget the noise of shareholders' headlines and sympathy that meant nothing. He thought isolation would save him. Instead, it hollowed him out. The intercom buzzed faintly. A distorted voice from the dock broke the rhythm of the storm. "Mr. Vane, this is Coast Security." 2 volunteers from the Charity Foundation arrived ahead of schedule. "Should we escort them to the mansion?" Alexander frowned. "Volunteers tonight." He had signed off a month ago for maintenance staff to help restore the island after the last hurricane. He hadn't expected anyone to actually come. "Send them to the guest house," he said coldly. But minutes later the power cut. The lights died and the wind slammed against the glass doors so violently it rattled the frames. He stood up, grabbed the lantern, and crossed the marble floor. The house creaked like an old ship. Somewhere beyond the storm a faint knock echoed. Then another, steady, desperate, human. He froze. No one could have reached the mansion this fast from the dock in weather like this. The knock came again, louder this time, mixed with a voice fragile but sharp enough to slice through the rain. "Please, open the door." Alexander hesitated, instincts battling logic. He unlatched the bolt and pulled the heavy door open. Lightning illuminated the 2 figures standing there. They were drenched, trembling, their white dresses clinging to their skin like a second layer. 2 young women identical. For a heartbeat, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. They looked barely in their 20s, their faces pale and angelic, reflected both fear and defiance. The one on the left held the other's hand tightly, her eyes white and pure. The one on the right stared directly into his, unflinching, as if testing whether he was real. "Who sent you?" he asked over the howling wind. The bold one answered her voice, trembling but steady. "You did. I didn't. Your letter said 2 volunteers were needed on the island. We thought we'd miss the last boat, but—" Her voice faltered as thunder cracked. The timid one whispered, "Please, we're cold." He hesitated again, scanning the darkness beyond them. "There's no one else, only us," the bold one said. Then, as if the words carried a hidden meaning, she leaned forward, her lips close enough for him to feel the warmth of her breath despite the chill. "You'll take both of us tonight," she whispered, "or none of us will survive this storm." The world seemed to pause. The words weren't seductive, they were desperate. Her eyes glimmered like someone making a bargain with fate. Another flash of lightning tore the sky open, and he saw the fear behind her composure. Against reason, he stepped aside. "Get in." They stumbled inside, dripping water, onto the marble floor. The timid one clutched her sister's arm, glancing nervously around the grand foyer with its portraits veiled in dust cloths. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elara," the gentle one murmured. "And you?" He turned to the other. "Lyra," she said, her gaze sharp, almost defiant. "Twins born." 3 minutes apart, Lyra replied, lifting her chin. "She likes to remind me she's older." Alexander set the lantern on the table, watching them shiver by the fire. There was something unsettling about their resemblance, something mirrored and incomplete. They shared the same face, but the light in their eyes burned differently. Alara's like dawn, Lyra's like lightning. "There's a guest room upstairs," he said. "You can stay until morning. The storm will calm by then." Alara nodded gratefully. Lyra, however, looked at him with a strange intensity. "You live here alone?" "Yes, you built all this just to be alone." "No," he said quietly, turning away. "I built it to keep the world out." She tilted her head, as if seeing through him. "And yet you opened the door." He didn't answer. The fire cracked between them, casting long shadows across the walls. The wind screamed through the chimneys, the sea pounding harder against the cliffs. He poured 3 cups of tea and placed them on the table. Alara's fingers trembled as she held the cup, whispering a soft thank you. Lyra watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "You don't look like a man who believes in accidents," she said. "And yet here we are, 2 strangers appearing at your door in a storm." "Coincidence?" he said flatly. "Or maybe," she replied, "a promise waiting to be fulfilled." Her tone was half mocking, half prophetic. Before he could respond, a sudden gust blew the windows open, extinguishing the fire. The room fell into darkness. Alara gasped, clutching her sister's hand. Alexander relit the lantern, the small flame trembling. In its glow, he caught their reflections. In the window, 3 faces blurred together by rain. For a moment, it looked like one fractured soul staring back at him. "You should rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we'll talk about why you're here." They nodded, but as they started up the staircase, Lyra paused, halfway turned back, and said softly, "If we hadn't found you tonight, the sea would have taken us." Aha met her gaze. "Then maybe it brought you here for a reason." She smiled faintly, the kind that hides too much. Maybe it did. When they disappeared into the hallway, Alexander stood alone before the darkened fire, the storm raging louder outside. He didn't know that their arrival had just rewritten the silence he had built for years. Somewhere deep inside, beneath grief and guilt, something shifted, something alive. The thunder rolled again, echoing through the mansion like a warning that nothing would ever be quiet on Valera again. Morning arrived like a fragile truce between light and silence. The storm had passed, leaving the island washed clean, every stone glistening under a pale sun. Inside the mansion, Alexander woke to the sound of waves lapping softly against the cliffs, a gentler rhythm than the night before. For the first time in years, the house did not feel completely dead. He walked through the hallways with a towel over his shoulders, the scent of salt and smoke still hanging in the air. Voices drifted faintly from the kitchen, soft and unfamiliar. When he reached the doorway, he saw Alara humming quietly as she cooked her hair pulled into a loose braid, steam curling around her face. Lyra sat on the counter, swinging her legs, reading an old book she must have found in the library. "You're awake," Alara said, smiling, her tone warm but cautious. "We found some supplies in the pantry. I hope you don't mind." "I don't," he said simply. He hadn't realized until that moment how strange it felt to have a woman's voice echo in this house again. Lyra closed the book and looked up. "You've got no mirrors here," he paused. "That's not a question. It's an observation," she replied. Why, he poured coffee into 3 cups and handed them each one. "Because mirrors lie," he said finally. "They show everything except the truth." Alara tilted her head. "What truth?" "The kind that hurts," he murmured, turning away. They exchanged a quick glance, but didn't press further. After breakfast, Alexander led them on a silent tour of the mansion. The building was an architectural wonderglass, stone and steel shaped by the elements. Yet every reflective surface had been removed. Even the windows were coated with an anti-glare film that turned them into opaque silver at certain angles. "The island used to have a lighthouse," he said, as they walked outside toward the cliffs. "It hasn't worked since the accident 3 years ago." "You mean the storm that killed your wife," Lyra said quietly. Alara shot her a warning look, but Alexander didn't flinch. "You've done your research," he replied. "Everyone remembers that story. The billionaire who built an island to hide from his ghosts." Lyra's tone was blunt, but her eyes softened. "I'm sorry. I just wanted to know why we were sent here." "Who exactly sent you?" he asked. "The Foundation's office. They said this island needed restoration workers, and you volunteered." "We needed a job," Alara said gently. "We've been drifting. This seemed like a place where we could start over." He nodded, though part of him wondered what they were really running from. The rest of the day passed in a strange calm. Alara tended to the neglected greenhouse, her hands gentle on the fragile stems. Lyra followed Alexander around the property, curious about everything. She asked questions about the solar panels, the desalination system, the way he lived alone. "Don't you ever get tired of silence?" she asked as they stood by the sea. "No," he said. "Silence is honest." "No," she countered, "it's lonely." Her words lingered in his chest long after she walked away. That evening they dined together again. The generator hummed softly in the background, keeping the lights alive. The air smelled of rain and rosemary. For the first time since he moved to Valera, Alexander didn't eat alone. He caught himself watching how Alara's eyes followed the flicker of the candles, how Lyra traced the rim of her glass with absent fingers. "Do you plan to stay long?" he asked. "Till the restoration is finished," Alara said. "Unless you ask us to leave." He didn't respond immediately. "You can stay," he said at last, "as long as you follow 3 rules." Lyra leaned forward, intrigued. "Rules first," he said. "No one leaves the island without my permission. The tides are dangerous, and the boat schedules are unpredictable. Second, no talk about the past. Not yours, not mine." "And the third?" Ilara asked softly. He looked at her for a long moment. "No mirrors." Lyra laughed lightly. "Still that one, yes," he said. "Especially that one." "You really think reflections can hurt you?" she teased. "Sometimes," he replied, "they remind you of who you used to be. And that can be worse than pain." The mood shifted, the laughter fading. Alara studied him quietly, sensing the weight beneath his calm. "Then we won't ask again," she said. Later that night, Alexander walked through the house alone. From the hallway, he could hear faint music, Alara playing piano in the lounge. The melody was simple, but haunting, a lullaby half remembered. Lyra's voice drifted in, humming along. The sound carried through the empty rooms like a ghost finally finding its way home. He stopped outside the door and watched them without speaking. The twins sat side by side at the piano bench, the contrast between them striking Alara's softness, Lyra's intensity, 2 halves of a reflection he couldn't face. He turned away before they saw him. In his bedroom, the only photograph he kept, a wedding picture lay face down on the dresser. He picked it up, stared at the smiling faces frozen in time, then placed it back. The temptation to smash it against the wall flared for a second, but he exhaled and set it gently down. Outside, thunder rumbled again, distant but heavy. In the kitchen, a cup clattered someone awake. He went down expecting Lyra's restless energy, but found Alara standing by the window, gazing at the sea. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "The sea sounds like it's still angry," she said. "It always is. Do you miss her?" The question slipped out before she could stop herself. He didn't answer right away, every day, but missing doesn't bring the dead back. She nodded, eyes shimmering with empathy, not pity. "Maybe not," she said softly, "but remembering does keep them alive." Her words struck something deep inside him. For the first time, he didn't feel offended by the intrusion. "Good night, Alara," he said quietly. "Good night, Mr. Vane." When he turned off the lantern and returned upstairs, he caught a glimpse of Lyra at the end of the corridor, leaning against the wall, watching silently. Her face was unreadable. For a heartbeat, he wondered if she had been standing there the entire time listening. The flicker of the lantern reflected briefly in her eyes before she stepped back into the shadows. And in that faint glimmer he saw it again, his own reflection, staring back from within someone else. The next morning came with a sky so still it seemed the island was holding its breath. After too much weeping, Alexander walked along the veranda, coffee in hand, watching the ocean flash like glass beneath the sunlight. Inside he could hear the faint shuffle of feet and the soft murmur of voices. The twins had brought sound back into this place that once only echoed with the sea. When he stepped into the main hall, Alara was tuning the old piano in the corner, her fingers tracing the dust off the keys as if greeting an old friend. Lyra leaned against the doorway, watching with quiet amusement. "You play?" Alexander asked. Alara looked up, startled, then nodded, a little. "My mother taught us before she—" She hesitated, lowering her eyes before she passed. He didn't push. "Then play," he said simply. She pressed the first note, hesitant, then another, until the melody began to fill the room, gentle, haunting, incomplete. Alexander froze. It was the same unfinished piece his late wife had written the week before she died. The sound pierced through his armor like light through cracked glass. He stepped closer, his breath unsteady. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. Alara blinked, sensing the shift. "It just came to me," she said softly. "Is it wrong?" "No," he whispered. "It's impossible." Lyra's eyes flickered with something sharp. Maybe she remembers what others forget. He ignored the tone, watching Alara's hands move with delicate precision. Every note carried both comfort and pain. When she finished, the silence that followed was almost holy. "You play like someone who's lost something," he said finally. "Or someone who's found it," she replied. Later, the three of them shared lunch on the terrace. The air was heavy with warmth, the ocean scent mingling with rosemary and salt. Lyra teased him about his solitary habits. Alara laughed softly, and the sound made something in his chest loosen. He didn't realize until then how long it had been since laughter had lived on this island. When the sun dipped lower, Alexander returned to his workshop by the cliffs. He needed to breathe away the memories, but they clung to him like sea mist. As he worked on a piece of driftwood sculpture, the door creaked open behind him. "You shouldn't be here," he said without looking up. "I didn't want to be alone." Alara's voice answered quietly. He turned. She stood by the doorway, hair tousled by wind eyes full of something uncertain. "You came to help, not to talk to ghosts," he said. "Maybe ghosts need someone to listen," she said, stepping closer. Her presence felt fragile, yet grounding. "I know what it's like to live with something unfinished." He stared at her, the sharpness in his breath softening. "I don't know if I can finish anything anymore." Then don't, she said, sitting beside him on the bench. Just start again. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the sea moved. Then he asked quietly, "Do you believe in promises?" "Only the ones made in silence," she said. "They last longer." The wind picked up again, tugging at the curtains. Her hand brushed against his arm as she steadied the wooden frame they were carving. The touch was unintentional, but it burned through him. He should have moved away. He didn't. Instead, his hand covered hers, rough against soft skin. Elara froze, but didn't pull back. "You're trembling," he murmured. "So are you," she whispered. Outside, the sky darkened as clouds rolled in from the horizon. The stormlight cast silver streaks across their faces. For the first time, he allowed himself to meet her gaze fully. Her eyes held no judgment, only a quiet understanding that disarmed him more than any beauty could. "I thought I was done feeling anything," he admitted. "You're not," she said. "You're just afraid of what it might bring." "Pain life," she corrected gently. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Somewhere behind them, the waves crashed harder. He released her hand, but the warmth lingered like a mark. "We should go inside," he said. "The tide's rising." "All right," she said, though neither moved immediately. When they finally stood, the wind scattered sawdust into the air, glittering like sparks. The faintest smile curved her lips, and for the first time he found himself smiling back. That night the island was calm again, the sea whispering against the shore like a secret shared only between them. Alexander couldn't sleep. Memories of that simple touch haunted him, the weightless kind that somehow anchored him more than years of solitude ever could. He went downstairs, drawn by faint music. Elara was sitting at the piano again, the room dimly lit by a single candle. She looked up as he entered, startled. "I couldn't sleep," she confessed. "The sea won't be quiet." "It never is," he said, standing beside her. The candlelight painted her face in shades of gold and shadow. He noticed the small scar near her wrist, the way her fingers trembled slightly over the keys. Without thinking, he reached out, covering her hand once more. "Play," he said softly. She began hesitant, and he guided her hand to finish the melody his wife had left behind. Together they filled in the missing notes, creating something new from what was broken. When the final chord faded, neither spoke. Their hands remained intertwined on the piano. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore, it was full. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For letting me touch something that matters," he swallowed, voice low. "You just made me remember what that means." The candle flickered a gust, brushing through the open window. He stood slowly, his eyes on her. "Good night, Elara." She nodded, her cheeks flushed, but her voice steady. "Good night, Alexander." When he walked away, she lifted her hand to her chest, as if holding the echo of his warmth. Upstairs, he stared at the ceiling until dawn, knowing something irreversible had begun. Somewhere between pain and peace, between ghosts and touch, a promise had silently been made. The days that followed were drenched in sunlight and unspoken tension. The island seemed softer now, as if it too were waking from a long grief. Elara moved through the mansion with quiet grace, her presence gentle like a breeze that never demanded attention, but changed everything it touched. Lyra, on the other hand, carried fire in her steps. She challenged silence-filled empty rooms with laughter and stirred something restless in the air. Alexander found himself watching both of them, though in different ways. With Elara, his heart eased. With Lyra, it raced. One morning, he found Lyra painting on the terrace, the ocean behind her turning to liquid sapphire. "You paint," he said, stepping closer. "When I'm bored," she replied without looking at him. "And are you bored now?" "Not yet." She smirked. "You're watching me, aren't you?" "I'm making sure you don't fall off the cliff." "I thought you liked living dangerously." He said nothing, but his silence made her smile widen. She set down the brush and met his eyes. "You're a hard man to figure out, Alexander Vane." Cold, distant, but underneath, "Don't finish that sentence," he warned. "Why? Because you're afraid someone might see you because you think you already do." Lyra's laughter was soft but cutting. "Maybe I do." She stepped closer, brushing past him as she picked up her scarf, the faint scent of paint and salt trailing after her. "You should smile more. You're beautiful when you forget to be haunted." The words struck deeper than he expected. That evening the air was heavy with humidity. Clouds gathered again over the horizon, dark and electric. Elara was tending the garden near the back patio while Lyra followed Alexander into the study, pretending to look for books, but really just studying him. "Your wife," she said suddenly. "Did she make you happy?" He looked up from his notes, eyes narrowing. "That's not your concern. Maybe not. But you still wear her grief like a crown. Do you ever take it off?" "You talk too much," he said, walking past her. She caught his wrist. "You need someone to remind you that you're still alive." He froze. Her touch was bold, confident, nothing like her sister's. For a moment the storm outside mirrored the one inside him. He pulled his hand free. "You don't know me." "Then let me," she whispered. Her voice trembled on the edge, between defiance and plea. He stepped back, but the distance felt thinner than air. Before he could speak, thunder cracked, the lights flickered, and rain began to fall in sheets against the windows. "You should go help your sister," he said quietly. "She's fine," Lyra replied. "She doesn't need saving, and you think I do." "I think you've been waiting for someone to ask." She moved closer, the candlelight flickering across her face, revealing the fragility beneath her confidence. "You're shaking," he said. "So are you." The electricity cut out completely. The room fell into darkness. Somewhere in the distance, Elara called their names, her voice faint against the storm. Lyra exhaled, stepping back slightly, her expression unreadable. "You won't admit it, but you want to be touched again," she said softly. "You want to feel, but you don't know how, without guilt eating you alive." "You should leave," he whispered. "Maybe tomorrow," she said, brushing past him toward the door. Before she disappeared, she turned, her eyes glowing like wet glass in the dim light. "Desire isn't sin, Alexander. It's just the body, remembering what the heart forgot." Then she was gone, leaving him with the thunder. That night he couldn't escape, the sound of rain or her voice echoing through his thoughts. Every word pressed against the parts of him he had buried. He walked the corridors restless, haunted by two women who mirrored each other, yet pulled him in opposite directions. When he reached the piano room, he found Elara there, asleep on the couch, a blanket half slipping from her shoulder. He covered her gently, his fingers brushing against her skin for barely a second. The smallest touch sent a tremor through him, tender, not forbidden. She stirred slightly, whispering something in her sleep, his name maybe he couldn't tell. He withdrew, guilt and longing tangled in his chest. The next morning brought calm skies and fragile peace. The storm had passed, but inside him another had just begun. Elara was in the greenhouse pruning roses, her hands stained with soil. "You didn't sleep," she said when she saw him. "No." Lyra told me you were working late. He nodded, unsure how much she knew. She worries me sometimes, Alara added softly. She hides behind her laughter, and you I hide behind silence. He looked at her, realizing both sisters were mirrors of his own. Fractures, one loud one, quiet, both dangerous. I don't know how to handle either of you, he confessed. Then don't try to, she said. Just be. Later that evening, the generator failed again, and they gathered by candlelight in the main room. Lyra poured wine, teasing him about his serious face, while Alara tuned the piano again. The shadows danced on the walls, making the house feel smaller, more intimate. You look human tonight, Lyra said, handing him a glass. That's a dangerous thing to say, he replied, half smiling. Dangerous is the only thing worth saying, she countered. Alara glanced between them, uneasy but silent. The candlelight flickered, catching the glint in Lyra's eyes. You fear loving us both, she said suddenly, her tone teasing but heavy with truth. But maybe love doesn't obey your rules. The air went still. Alexander's grip on the glass tightened. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The power of her words left no room for denial. Outside, thunder rumbled again, softer this time as if listening. Lyra's gaze lingered on him, unafraid. Alara looked away, her fingers trembling over the piano keys. The tension between them was no longer invisible. It hummed like electricity between storms. The candle guttered and died. Darkness consumed the room. In the black silence, he felt a hand brush his warm, trembling, unsure whose it was. He didn't pull away. When the generator clicked back to life, the light revealed all three of them frozen in the moment, between guilt and desire. No words were spoken. None were needed. Something irreversible had happened, and they all knew it. The island had claimed another secret, and in its quiet heart, the second promise was made, the promise of desire, wild and silent, born from longing and fear, destined to burn them all. The days grew longer, but the air on the island carried a strange heaviness, like something unseen had settled between the three of them. Alexander tried to convince himself that what happened during the storm was nothing more than confusion, born from fear and darkness. But the memory lingered like the scent of rain that refused to fade. Each time he saw Alara tending the flowers, or heard Lyra laughing in the distance, the space between guilt and desire narrowed, until he could no longer tell which was which. The island seemed to breathe with them, restless and alive. At breakfast, silence stretched across the table. Lyra stirred her tea slowly, her eyes flicking between them, with a knowing glint. Alara spoke softly about rebuilding the greenhouse roof, pretending not to notice the tension that vibrated in every word unspoken. When Alexander finally looked up, Lyra smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of her lips. "You dream loud, Mr. Vane," she said. Alara froze. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Lyra said, still holding his gaze, "that the past isn't the only ghost in this house anymore." Alexander set down his cup. "Enough." Lyra laughed softly. "You don't deny it." He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. "I said enough." Alara's voice trembled. "Lyra, please." But Lyra's eyes softened then. "I'm just reminding him that life doesn't wait for permission." She rose and brushed past them, the door swinging shut behind her. The room fell silent except for the steady sound of waves outside. Alara stared at the table, her fingers curling into her lap. "She doesn't mean harm," she said quietly. "She just doesn't know when to stop." "She knows exactly when to stop," he said. "She just wants to see what happens if she doesn't." That night, Alexander walked the cliffs alone, the wind cold against his face. He could see the faint light of the greenhouse below where Alara worked late, and beyond it, the flicker of Lyra's lantern near the dock. Two flames close enough to touch, yet destined to burn him from both sides. When he returned to the house, the piano was playing again. Alara's melody drifted through the corridors, soft and aching. He paused by the doorway and watched her play. She didn't see him, and he let the music speak for both of them. When the final note faded, he stepped forward. "You shouldn't stay up so late," she smiled faintly. "You shouldn't walk cliffs alone. I needed air. And did you find it? Not the kind that helps." She turned to him, then her eyes luminous in the low light. "Lyra told me what she said to you. She shouldn't have." No, Alara whispered, but she was right. He frowned. "About what?" "About you being afraid of life, afraid to feel something that doesn't hurt." She stood close enough for him to see the reflection of his own confusion in her eyes. "You don't have to be afraid with me." He wanted to believe her, but even as he reached for her hand, a knock sounded at the door. Lyra stood there, soaked again from rain that had begun to fall without warning. "The generator's gone out by the dock," she said, her voice clipped. "I need help." Alexander hesitated. Alara nodded. "Go, I'll wait here." He followed Lyra into the storm. The path to the dock was slick and dangerous, the wind fierce enough to make speech impossible. They worked in silence, securing the wires, restoring the backup power. When it was done, she turned to him, suddenly rain streaming down her face. "You shouldn't look at her that way," she said. "What way? Like she's your salvation? And what are you?" The reminder that salvation always costs something. Her words hit him harder than the rain. "Lyra." She stepped closer. "You think she's light, but you forget that I'm part of her." She reached up, her fingers grazing his jaw, her breath warm against the cold air. "You don't get to choose one without the other." He caught her wrist, not to push her away, but to stop himself from closing the distance. "Don't do this. I'm not the one doing it," she whispered. The thunder swallowed the rest. When they returned to the house, Alara was waiting in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide. The truth was already written across her expression. She had seen enough, the nearness, the look that neither of them could explain away. "Alara," he began, but she shook her head, tears glinting. "You don't have to explain. I understand." "You don't," he said, stepping forward. "I do," she said. "You're lost, Alexander. And when you're lost, you hold on to whatever keeps you from drowning, even if it hurts someone else." Her words cut cleanly. She turned and ran out into the rain. He chased after her, the world a blur of water and wind. Near the cliffs, she slipped, her screams swallowed by the sea. He lunged forward, grabbing her just before she fell. They collapsed onto the wet ground, his heart hammering. "You could have died," he shouted. "Then maybe I wouldn't have to feel this way," she cried. "Like I'm the shadow of my own sister." The words struck him like lightning. He held her face in his hands. "You're not her shadow. Then why can't you look at me without seeing her?" He had no answer. The rain pounded harder, their breaths ragged in the chaos. "Go back inside," he said finally. She stood trembling, then whispered, "I can't stay here." "Please," he said, his voice breaking, "don't leave. You need to decide who you are before you ask anyone to stay." She turned and walked away, through the storm, her figure fading into mist. Alexander stayed there long after she disappeared, the sea crashing below like punishment. When he finally returned, Lyra was waiting by the window, her face unreadable. "She'll come back," Lyra said. "She always does." He didn't answer. He sank into the nearest chair, drenched, shaking his mind, a storm louder than the one outside. For the first time he hated the sound of the sea. Upstairs he heard a door close, the last echo of a choice he hadn't yet made. And in that silence, something inside him cracked a fracture that could no longer be mended by touch or desire. The house had become what it always was, a place where love went to lose its way. The night the fire began, the air on Valera felt wrong. The wind carried no salt, no scent of seaweed or storm, only the dry whisper of heat. Alexander had spent the entire day in the workshop trying to lose himself in routine carving shapes from driftwood that no longer resembled anything human. Ilara had gone silent since their argument, keeping to the greenhouse, while Lyra wandered restlessly, her laughter echoing through the halls like a ghost that refused to fade. At dusk, thunder rolled in the distance, but brought no rain. The horizon glowed faintly red, the kind of light that warned of disaster. Alexander walked out onto the veranda just as a gust of wind tore through the valley, slamming shutters, scattering papers, and knocking over the lantern by his workbench. Its shattered oil spilling across the floor, and within seconds the fire, caught small but vicious. He rushed to smother it, but another gust fanned the flames, higher, feeding them with oxygen and memory. "Ilara!" he shouted. The wind drowned his voice. Smoke thickened, curling up toward the skylight. He grabbed a cloth and tried to beat down the fire, coughing, the air choking. Somewhere in the distance, he heard Lyra scream his name. He ran toward the sound, his vision blurred. The hall was already burning heat, pulsing like a living creature. The mansion that once kept the world away now devoured itself. He found Lyra near the piano room, clutching a canvas, trying to drag it away from the flames. "Leave it," he shouted. "It's just a painting." "It's hers," she cried, her voice breaking. "It's all that's left of her." He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door, but she resisted until the smoke forced her to stumble. "Where's Ilara in the greenhouse?" Lyra gasped. He froze. The greenhouse sat on the far edge of the property, surrounded by glass and wood. If the fire reached it, she wouldn't stand a chance. He turned and ran. The path outside was lit orange by the reflection of the flames, the air hot enough to sting his lungs. He could hear the glass shattering as he approached. Inside, Ilara was trapped, behind fallen beams, the plants around her burning like torches. "Alexander," she screamed. "I can't get out." He smashed through the door, the heat swallowing him whole. The smoke made it impossible to breathe. He used his jacket to shield his face, pushing through until he reached her. "Don't move," he shouted, kicking the beam aside. She fell into his arms, coughing. "Where's Lyra?" "Still inside," she choked. He lifted her and carried her out the world, spinning in flames. When they reached the open air, he set her down near the shore and turned back. "You can't go," she said weakly, clutching his sleeve. "You'll die, not if she's still in there." "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Don't leave me alone again." He touched her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. "I'll come back." Then he ran into the fire. The mansion was collapsing by the minute. He could hear the roof groaning above him, the piano melting into a shapeless ruin. "Lyra," he shouted, "answer me." A faint cough came from the far corner. He followed the sound, finding her half-conscious, the painting still clutched to her chest. He dropped to his knees beside her. "Let it go." "No," she whispered, eyes fluttering open. "I promised her." "You promised who?" Your wife, she gasped. The word froze him. What are you talking about? She found us years ago before she died. She helped us, said if anything ever happened, we should come to you. Her voice broke into coughing fits. We owed her our lives. The revelation hit him like a second fire. That's why you came, not me, she whispered. Elara didn't know. I came because I wanted to see the man she loved so much. She still prayed for him in her last breath. Tears blurred his vision. The roof groaned louder, embers falling like stars. We have to go. He lifted her, but she grabbed his collar weakly. You'll take both of us tonight, she murmured, her voice faint, the same words from the storm. One in your arms, one in your heart. He shook his head. Don't you dare say goodbye. You already did, she breathed, and her hand went limp. Panic surged through him. No. He pulled her closer, refusing to let her slip away. Flames closed in the heat, unbearable. With the last of his strength, he carried her out, stumbling into the rain that had finally begun to fall. The sky opened above them, as if morning pouring water over fire and flesh. Elara ran toward them, her face pale. She's alive? He said, though his voice trembled with doubt. They laid Lyra on the ground near the shore, rain pounding around them. Elara pressed her ear to her sister's chest, tears mixing with soot. She's breathing, she cried. Relief and anguish tangled together. Alexander knelt beside them, his hands shaking. The mansion behind them was collapsing, beams crashing into the flames, sending sparks into the night sky. We need to get her off the island, he said. The boat. The storm's too strong, Elara said. We'll never make it. He looked toward the lighthouse, its glass cracked, but still standing. There's an emergency flare inside. We can call for rescue. Together they carried Lyra through the rain, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. Inside the lighthouse, the air was cold and damp, untouched by fire. He found the flare gun, fired it into the sky. The red light arched through the darkness, a fragile promise against the storm. Elara sat beside her sister, stroking her hair. She saved your life, she whispered. No, Alexander said quietly, his voice breaking. She saved both of us. The fire outside began to die, leaving behind black smoke and the distant hiss of rain. Lyra stirred faintly, her lips parting. Did we make it? You're safe, Elara whispered. Rest. Her eyes fluttered open, meeting Alexander's for one last moment. Promise me, she said weakly. Anything, don't waste the light she left you. Then her hand slipped from his, falling still. Elara sobbed, clutching her sister's body. Alexander sat beside them, staring at the ruined mansion. Through the open doorway, the flames finally surrendering to the sea. The night was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, one born from loss and love, tangled so tightly that neither could be undone. He closed his eyes, hearing her final whisper echo in the wind. You'll take both of us tonight. One in your arms, one in your heart. Morning came with the pale gray of a wounded sky. Smoke still curled above the blackened ruins of the mansion, drifting toward the sea like something reluctant to leave. Alexander stood at the edge of the shore, the salt wind cutting through the soot on his skin, watching the rescue boat disappear beyond the waves. Lyra lay inside, unconscious but alive, carried away under the care of the medics who had arrived before dawn. The island felt quieter now, but not peaceful, more like a body holding its breath between life and death. Behind him, Elara approached, wrapped in a blanket, too thin for the cold. Her face was streaked with ash and tears, but her voice was steady. They said she'll make it, she whispered. He nodded through the words barely reached him. She lost a lot of blood. She'll wake up, Alara said almost to herself. She always does. Alexander turned to look at her, the reflection of the dying fire still burning faintly in her eyes. You should rest, he said. You've been awake all night. So have you. She walked closer, her bare feet sinking into the damp sand. For a while they stood in silence, the kind that made sound feel intrusive. Do you ever stop blaming yourself? She asked finally. He didn't answer. She sighed. You didn't cause the fire, Alexander. No, he said quietly, but I didn't stop it either. The wind carried the words away before they could sting too deeply. Together they walked back toward what was left of the house. The walls were gone, the roof collapsed, but the foundation still stood blackened and stubborn. Alara began to pick through the debris, her hands careful searching for anything salvageable. There's nothing worth keeping, he said. There's always something, she replied. She found a piece of the piano's ivory key, cracked but still gleaming faintly beneath the ash. See, she said softly. Even after the fire, some things refuse to be destroyed. He watched her, realizing how different she looked now. No longer fragile, no longer a visitor. She belonged to this place the way light belonged to the sea. That afternoon, rain came again, soft and cleansing. They took refuge inside the old lighthouse, the only building left untouched. The air smelled of salt and old books. Alara tended to his burned hand, wrapping it carefully with strips of cloth. You should have let the rescuers do this, he murmured. They had other people to help, she said. Besides, you'd never sit still for them. You sound like you know me. I do now. He smiled faintly. You shouldn't. People who get close to me end up hurt. Then I'll stand just far enough not to break, she said, tying the final knot on his bandage. He looked at her, then really looked, and something fragile but real stirred between them. You don't have to stay, he said. Once they come back, you can leave with them. And go where she asked. The world outside doesn't need me. Maybe this place does. He didn't argue. They spent the next few days rebuilding small things, the greenhouse door, the stone path, the garden that had somehow survived beneath the ash. Each task was quiet, deliberate, like an apology offered to the earth. At night they cooked simple meals and sat by the lantern's light, speaking little. The silence between them changed shape. It was no longer grief, but something gentler, something waiting. One evening, while mending a fishing net by the doorway, Alara said Lyra used to say that pain is just love with nowhere to go. Alexander looked up. Then what does that make guilt? Maybe love that stayed too long. He set down the net and leaned back, the truth of her words sinking deep. I destroyed everything that ever tried to love me, he said finally. Alara didn't flinch. Maybe that's what love is. Destruction that teaches you to rebuild. He looked at her, and for the first time the weight on his chest eased. That night he dreamt of the fire again, but this time the flames didn't consume him. They revealed the outlines of something new. The next morning a letter arrived with the returning boat. It was from the hospital. Lyra had survived the surgery but hadn't woken. The doctors didn't know if she would. Alara read the words in silence, then folded the paper and handed it to him. She's fighting, she said. He nodded. She always was the stronger one. No, Alara whispered, she was the braver one. There's a difference. For days they waited for another message. Alexander kept the lighthouse lit every night, as if its glow could reach across the sea to wherever Lyra slept. Sometimes Alara would find him there, standing by the railing staring into the dark. "Do you think she'll forgive me?" he asked once. "For what? For surviving her?" Alara stepped closer, resting her hand over his heart. "She'd never blame you for that. She'd thank you for remembering her." He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of her touch seep through the cold that never left him. "You still believe in forgiveness," he said quietly. "It's the only thing stronger than fire," she replied. Time passed differently after that. The island began to heal. The air smelled of wet earth. Instead of smoke, flowers bloomed again along the path to the cliffs, and the ocean lost its anger. Yet in quiet moments the silence still returned, thick and haunting. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded words, but the kind that forced them to listen to what was gone, to what still remained. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Alexander found Alara in the garden, her hands buried in the soil. "It's strange," she said, not looking up. "Everything burned, yet the roots survived." He crouched beside her. "Maybe that's how we start again." She met his eyes and smiled faintly. "Together, if you'll let me." They worked until dusk, the air between them carrying no guilt, only quiet understanding. When the first stars appeared, Alexander lit the lantern in the lighthouse and watched the beam stretch across the sea. Somewhere beyond that line of light, Lyra was still breathing, still part of the silence that held them all together. He whispered into the wind, though no one could hear, "I'm still here." And for the first time since the fire, the silence didn't answer back. It simply stayed gentle and alive, no longer a punishment, but a promise. The letter arrived on a windless morning, carried by a courier from the mainland. Alexander was in the lighthouse, repairing the railing when Alara climbed the steps to find him. Her hands trembled slightly as she held out the envelope. "It's from the hospital," she said. He wiped the dust from his palms, took it, and stared at the seal for a long time before opening it. The words were brief, clinical, yet devastating. Lyra was awake, but her memory had been severely affected. She didn't remember the fire. She didn't remember the island. She didn't remember him. Alexander sank onto the bench, the paper falling from his hand. For a moment he said nothing. Alara knelt beside him, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "She's alive," she whispered, as if saying it aloud would make it more real. "She's alive," he echoed, but his voice carried no triumph, only weight. Days later, a second letter arrived, this time written in Lyra's own uneven handwriting. "I don't remember much it began. Faces, places, moments they come and go, like smoke. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I see light. I think it's from the island. I don't know who you are, Alexander, but I feel you in the quiet, like someone who once saved me from fire. Don't come. Let this be my new beginning." There was no bitterness, only clarity. At the end, one line stood alone. "Don't choose me, choose peace. Because I remember enough, and that's enough." Alexander read it twice, then folded the letter and placed it inside the piano's cracked frame where the soundboard once sang. He didn't cry. He only breathed long and slow, as though letting go of something that had been haunting him since before he knew it existed. Alara stood in the doorway watching him. "She meant it," she said softly. "She wants you to be free." "She was the one who was supposed to be free," he said. "Not me. You can't trade your pain for hers. That's not how love works." He turned toward her eyes, dark and hollow. "Then tell me, Alara, how does it work?" She took a step closer. "It's sacrifice. The kind that doesn't ask for recognition, the kind that stays when no one sees. Her words hung in the air, fragile but firm. Outside gulls circled the cliffs, their cries sharp against the quiet. Alexander looked back at the sea. "She came here because of my wife," he said after a long silence. "Lyra said she helped them once, that she told them to find me if they ever needed safety." "Maybe it wasn't her voice that called them here," Alara said. "Maybe it was yours." He shook his head. "I don't deserve that kind of redemption." "None of us do," she replied. "That's why it's a gift." The following morning, he took the small rowboat out to sea. Alara stood on the shore, watching him disappear into the horizon. He didn't tell her where he was going, but she knew. When he returned at sunset, his hands were empty, his eyes wet with salt water and something deeper. "You scattered her ashes?" she asked. He nodded. "I couldn't keep them. She doesn't belong to grief anymore." Alara reached for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. "You made the third promise," she said quietly. "Sacrifice." He looked down at their joined hands, rough against soft scar, against skin. "It doesn't feel like peace yet." "It will," she said, "but only when you stop trying to earn it." That night the island was still. The air smelled of new rain and charred earth. They sat together on the steps of the lighthouse, the beam sweeping slowly across the sea. "Do you ever think she'll remember?" he asked. "Maybe not with her mind," Alara said. "But hearts have longer memories than we give them credit for." He smiled faintly. "You talk like you've lived 1,000 lives. Maybe I just listen more than most." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he let her. The silence between them no longer felt like an echo of loss, but the beginning of something fragile and real. In the weeks that followed, life returned to the island. The foundation they had dreamed of, the 3 promises, began to take shape. They converted the lighthouse's lower chambers into a shelter for women and children from the mainland who needed a place to start over. The name spread quickly, whispered with reverence, a story of survival that carried no names but spoke of hope. One evening, as the last of the volunteers departed for the night, Alexander found Alara standing by the water, her dress fluttering in the breeze. "You've built something beautiful," he said. "We built it," she corrected. "No," he said softly. "You did. You took what was broken and turned it into something that saves." She turned to him, her eyes shimmering in the dying light. "You think I saved you? Didn't you?" "No, Alexander. You saved yourself when you decided to stay." He wanted to believe her. The waves lapped gently against the shore. The same rhythm that once felt like accusation now sounded like forgiveness. "I keep hearing her voice," he admitted. "Lyra's, yes. It's strange. Not the words, just the feeling, like she's still somewhere nearby." "Maybe she is," Alara said. "Love doesn't vanish. It just changes its shape." He looked out over the horizon, the water glowing gold under the sunset. "Then what shape does it take now, this?" she whispered, taking his hand again. "Whatever this is." For a long moment, they stood without moving, the sea wrapping its hush around them. Somewhere in that silence, Alexander understood what she meant. The third promise wasn't about loss, it was about letting love live without ownership. Later that night, when the stars came out, he climbed to the top of the lighthouse alone. From there he could see everything, the garden, the broken mansion, the endless sea. The beam turned slowly, steady as a heartbeat. He closed his eyes, feeling the wind against his face, and whispered into the dark, "Thank you, Lyra, for teaching me how to let go." Down below, Alara watched from the courtyard, her heart aching with something she couldn't name. The man who had once been consumed by fire now stood above it, bathed in light. She smiled faintly, tears warm on her cheeks. The promise of sacrifice had been kept, and in keeping it, he had unknowingly set them both free. Months passed, and the island no longer felt haunted. The garden bloomed again, wild and vibrant, stretching over the blackened ground where the mansion once stood. The sound of hammers and saws echoed from the new construction site near the lighthouse, a shelter that Alexander and Alara named the Foundation of Three Promises. It was built not from marble or steel, but from the remnants of the house that burned each beam and stone, carrying a memory. Each wall a quiet prayer for renewal. Volunteers from the mainland came every week, young men and women who had heard whispers of the island that once swallowed grief and gave back hope. Alexander no longer hid from them. He worked alongside them, sleeves rolled up hands, blistered his laughter, no longer foreign to the air. Yet some nights when the sea turned silver and the wind rose just enough to stir the lantern flames, the silence would come back, not to punish but to remind. He would walk down to the shore barefoot and stand where the waves lapped at his feet. There he spoke to the water as if it still carried her voice. "I kept my promise," he'd whisper. "You're free now." Alara would watch from the distance, never interrupting. She understood that forgiveness was a private act even when shared. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the hospital. It was short. Lyra had recovered enough to travel. She had regained some of her memory, but not all. The letter ended with a single line written in her handwriting. "I want to see the island again." Alexander stared at the words for a long time, feeling his pulse quicken in ways he thought he'd outgrown. Ilara found him on the dock that evening, the unopened envelope still in his hand. "She's coming," he said simply. Ilara didn't flinch. "Then we'll welcome her." "You don't have to stay for that," he said quietly. "I want to," she replied. The promises were made by all three of us. The day Lyra returned, the sky was clear, the sea calm. The boat approached slowly, cutting through the glass-like water. When she stepped onto the dock, Alexander's breath caught, not because she looked the same, but because she didn't. Her hair was shorter, her eyes softer, no longer burning with rebellion, but shimmering with peace. She smiled faintly. "It feels smaller," she said. "Everything does when you're no longer running from it," he replied. Ilara came forward, embracing her sister tightly. "You came back," she whispered. "You really came back." "I had to," Lyra said. "Something kept calling me. I thought it was memory, but now I think it's forgiveness." For a moment, all three stood together again, the wind tangling their hair, the lighthouse beam sweeping over them like a slow heartbeat. Inside the new shelter, Lyra walked through each room, touching the walls as if reading their story through her fingertips. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "You built this, we did," Ilara said. "But it was his idea." Lyra turned to Alexander, her gaze gentle but searching. "You've changed," she said. "So have you. Maybe that's what fire does," she said with a small smile. "It burns everything false until only truth remains." He nodded. "And what truth did it leave you? That love doesn't die," she said. "It just learns to live elsewhere." That evening they sat by the shore. Lyra listened as Alara spoke of the foundation's work, of the women they'd helped, of the lives rebuilt from ashes. Alexander remained mostly silent, his thoughts caught between gratitude and guilt. When night fell, Lyra turned to him. "You're still carrying it," she said quietly. "The fire, the guilt, the promises. You've forgiven everyone but yourself." He met her eyes. "Some things don't deserve forgiveness. "Then why did you build this place?" she asked. "Why name it after promises, if not to prove that we're more than our mistakes?" He looked away, unable to answer. She reached for his hand, the same gesture that once sparked chaos, but now brought peace. "Forgiveness isn't saying it didn't hurt," she said. "It's saying it mattered, but it no longer owns you." Elara watched them, her heart aching in the best possible way. There was no jealousy left, no old wound reopening, only understanding. When Lyra retired to the guest house, Alexander and Elara stayed by the water. The stars stretched endless above them. "You've carried all 3 promises," Elara said softly. "Touch, desire, sacrifice. Maybe it's time for the 4th. The 4th," he asked. "Forgiveness." He exhaled slowly. "For her, for yourself," she said. "Because you did the hardest thing a man can do, you stayed." He turned toward her, eyes shining with reflection. "I don't know how to forgive myself for what happened." "You already have," she said. "You just haven't realized it." She reached for his hand, and for the first time he didn't feel the urge to pull away or apologize. They sat like that for a long time, the tide drawing lines in the sand that vanished before morning. Days later, Lyra came to him with one last request. "I want to leave something here," she said. In the lighthouse gallery, she hung a single painting, a swirl of blue gold and crimson. At first glance, it looked like chaos, but when the light hit it just right, a shape emerged, 3 figures standing by a shore, one fading into the horizon. Beneath it, she wrote a small inscription. 3 promises were made here, one to touch, one to desire, one to let go. The 4th was to forgive. When she stepped back, tears filled her eyes. "This is the last time I'll come," she said. "It's home, but it's also the place that set me free." Alexander placed a hand over his heart. "Then it's both of ours." She smiled, kissed his cheek, and whispered, "Thank you for keeping the light on." The next morning she was gone, leaving behind only the painting and the scent of lavender on the wind. That night, as the last of the construction lights went out, Alexander stood with Elara at the base of the lighthouse. The foundation below them hummed with life voices, laughter healing. 3 promises were made here, he said quietly. Touch, desire, sacrifice. And the 4th, Elara asked. "The one that makes them all matter," he said, taking her hand. "Forgiveness." The lighthouse beam turned, catching their faces in its glow. He smiled a real smile, this time not haunted, not heavy. "Maybe love was never meant to save us," he said softly. "Maybe it was meant to teach us how to start again." Elara's fingers intertwined with his. "Then let's live for that one." Above them, the light swept over the sea, guiding ships through the night, the symbol of everything they had lost and found again. And as the waves carried the reflection across the water, Alexander whispered into the wind, not to the past, but to the future. The 4th promise is kept. A full year passed before the island felt entirely reborn. Where the old mansion once stood, wild roses climbed along new white fences, and the scent of salt and lavender drifted together through the warm summer air. The sea had grown calm again, no longer the mirror of grief, but a friend that carried light back to the shore. Every dawn, the lighthouse beam stretched across the waves like a steady heartbeat, guiding distant ships and strangers home. To most travelers, Valera Island was now a sanctuary, a place whispered about in cafes and classrooms said to heal whatever pain one carried there. But for Alexander Vane, it was simply home, the place that had broken and remade him. That morning he stood by the dock watching a group of volunteers board the departing boat. Elara handed them boxes of supplies, her laughter echoing softly against the cliffs. When she turned, the sun lit her face in gold, and Alexander thought she looked like the first morning after a long winter. "You're staring," she said, teasing, brushing dust from her hands. "I'm memorizing," he replied, "in case the light ever goes out." "It won't," she said. "Not as long as you're here to keep it burning." He smiled, knowing the light would outlast them both. Together they walked toward the lighthouse, where a small crowd gathered for the anniversary of the foundation of 3 Promises. Children played near the gardens, women from the mainland helped decorate the steps, and music floated through the air, soft piano chords recorded from a piece Alara and Alexander had written together. The island had found its rhythm again. Inside the lighthouse gallery, the walls were lined with photographs and letters from those who had come seeking peace and left whole again. At the center hung Lyra's final painting, framed now beneath glass. The inscription glowed faintly in the sunlight that filtered through the tall windows. 3 promises were made here, one to touch, one to desire, one to let go. The 4th was to forgive. People stopped to read it, some wiping tears, some smiling quietly. Alexander often stood before it when no one was around. He would trace the edge of the glass, remembering her laughter, her fire, her last words. She was gone, but never absent. Her presence lingered in the rhythm of the tides, in the light that never dimmed, in the memory of what it meant to love without possession. That afternoon, as the celebration wound down, Alara found him outside, sitting on the rocks facing the horizon. "You're quiet," she said. "I'm thinking." "About her." He nodded. "About all of it. The promises, the fire. How everything that felt like an ending turned out to be a beginning." She sat beside him, their shoulders touching. "Do you regret anything?" she asked. He thought for a long time before answering. "Only the years I spent refusing to live." "Then don't waste another," she said softly. He looked at her, then the sunlight in her hair, the calm steadiness in her eyes. "You stayed," he whispered, "even when you could have left." "You never asked me to stay," she said. "That's why I did." The wind shifted, carrying the sound of gulls and waves. It smelled of home. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver key, the original from the mansion, now worn smooth by time. "I kept this," he said, "not because it opened anything, but because it reminded me I once locked myself away." He placed it in her hand. "Now it's yours." She turned it over gently. "What am I supposed to do with it?" "Whatever you want," he said. "Build something new, or throw it into the sea." She smiled, closed her fingers around it, and whispered, "I'll keep it, as proof that doors can be opened again." That evening the sky blazed in colors only the sea could reflect. Orange melting into rose, then deep indigo. The guests had gone, leaving only the 2 of them and the sound of the ocean breathing against the rocks. Alexander stood at the top of the lighthouse balcony, the wind whipping through his hair. Alara climbed the final steps behind him, her dress fluttering like a wave. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said. "It is," he replied, "and terrifying, because beauty always reminds us that time is moving." "Then let's not waste it watching," she said, stepping beside him. Below them, the beam began its slow rotation, sweeping across the water. The world felt vast, alive, forgiving. Alexander turned to her. "You once told me love is destruction that teaches us to rebuild. Do you still believe that?" she asked. "Now I think it's something gentler," he said. "Love is light that stays even when you stop looking." She smiled, eyes glistening. "Then the lighthouse will never go dark." They stood in silence as the beam passed over them, illuminating their faces in soft gold. For a moment, everything else disappeared, the pain, the fire, the ghosts, and there was only this two souls who had walked through loss and chosen to stay in the light. Far below the sea, shimmered with reflections, each one like a memory refusing to fade. As night deepened, Elara leaned her head on his shoulder. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We keep the light on," he said simply, "for whoever needs to find their way." She nodded, and they stayed there until the stars took their place one by one across the sky. The beam turned again, slow and steady, cutting through the dark. And as the waves carried its reflection to the horizon, a soft voice seemed to echo in the distance, not haunting but blessing. Some loves are not meant to last, only to teach us how to live. Alexander closed his eyes and smiled. "The lighthouse still shines," he whispered. "And it always would." Before you leave this story, take a deep breath and think about what forgiveness truly means to you. Maybe it's something you owe to someone else, or maybe it's the one thing you've never given yourself. On this island, every wave carried pain away and brought back light, and perhaps that's what we all need to remember, that love isn't always about holding on, but about letting go with grace. If Alexander, Elara, and Lyra's journey touched you in any way, if it made you feel the ache of loss or the quiet power of healing, then don't let the feeling fade when the video ends. Carry it with you, share it, and let it remind you that even after fire, the heart can still bloom again. Comment below and tell us which of the promises spoke to you most. Touch, desire, sacrifice, or forgiveness. Tell us which moment broke you and which one helped you breathe again. And if you've ever loved someone enough to let them go, write their initials in the comments, not for sadness, but for remembrance, because every story like this becomes complete only when you add your voice to it. Subscribe to Emma's Stories if you believe that love can still save us in a world that often forgets what it means to feel. Turn on the bell not for updates, but as your own lighthouse, so that whenever the next story comes, you'll know light is finding its way back to you. Share this story with someone who needs to forgive someone who's been carrying their own ashes too long. Maybe they'll find hope here. Maybe they'll see that no storm, no fire, no heartbreak can truly erase the parts of us meant to shine. And if you're still reading this, still feeling that quiet pull in your chest, then this promise is for you. Whatever you've lost, whatever burned, you will rise from it. Because the heart always remembers light. So comment, "I keep the light on," if you're choosing to believe in love again. If you're ready to forgive, rebuild, and begin. Your story isn't over. It's only waiting for the tide to turn. The lighthouse still shines, and maybe tonight it's shining for you.